Hello everyone. In this video I will show you how to create a web application using PHP that performs CRUD operations. This means that this application allows us to create clients, to read clients, to update clients, and also to delete clients. So first let's create a new client. Let's fill this form. Then let's click on Submit. But here we have this error message because all the fields are required. So here let's provide the address. Then let's click on Submit. So here we can see that this new client has been added, and also we are redirected to the index page. Now let's edit the data of this client. So let's click on Edit. So here we can see that we have already the data of the selected client. Let's, for example, update the address. We can also update the email address. Let's click on Submit. And here we can see that the email address and the address have been updated. Now to delete a client, we have just to click on Delete. So here I am using XAMPP, and for more information how to install XAMPP, you can see the video link that is available in the description. Now let's go to PHP MyAdmin, and let's create a new database. Let's call it MyShop. Let's click on Create. So here we can see that this database has been created. And to create a new table inside this database, we have just to click on SQL. Then here we have to write the SQL queries that allow us to create a new table and to fill it with some data. So the first query allows us to create the table called clients, which contains the ID, and the ID here is auto-incremental. Also we have the name, the email, the phone, the address, and created at. So here we can see that the email should be unique. And we can see that created at is a date time and has a default value. Then the second query allows us to add 6 rows into the table. Now to execute the two queries, we have just to click on this button. And here we can see that the queries have been executed correctly. Now let's click on Structure. And let's click on this table. So here we can see that we have 6 rows into this table. Now I will create a new PHP project using Visual Studio Code. So let's create a new folder. So I will create this new folder on the public folder of XAMPP. So let's go to the folder that contains XAMPP. Then let's open the public folder of XAMPP, which is called htdocs. And here let's create a new folder for our project. Let's call it MyShop. And let's select it. Now let's create a new PHP file inside this folder. Let's call it index.php. So this index file will be used to show the list of the clients. So here let's write exclamation mark and let's press enter. And we obtain this template, so we can change the title of this file. So here let's write MyShop. Then we need to add Bootstrap to this file. So let's go to the browser. And here let's type Bootstrap. Let's go to this first link, then let's scroll down and let's click on this button. So here we need to scroll down. And here we can see the CDN links. So I want to add the CSS to the file, that's why I need to copy this URL. Now in the head we need to add a new element. So the new element is link. And in the href we need to paste the URL that we have copied. Now in the body we need to add the container. Now let's add the margin to this container. Then inside the container we can display the title of this page. So here let's write list of clients. Then let's add a button that allows us to create a new client. So this button is called new client, and it should allow us to create a new client. So in the href we have to provide the URL of the page that allows us to create a new client. So let's suppose that the PHP file that allows us to create a new client is called create.php and is available in this folder. So the URL of this file will be / then the name of the folder, which is my shop, then / and then we have to provide the file name, which is create.php. So this file does not exist for the moment and we need to create it later. Now let's create the HTML table. Then let's add the header row into this table. So here we can see that in this table we have 7 columns. Now let's add the body of this table. So in the body we have only this row. So in this row we have 6 cells with the data of the client, and in the cell number 7 we have 2 buttons. So this is the edit button, and it should take us to the PHP file that allows us to edit the client. And here we have the delete button. So the URL of the edit button should be / then the name of the folder, which is my shop, then the name of the PHP file that allows us to edit the client, which is edit.php. So this file does not exist for the moment and we need to create it. And for the delete button we have to provide the URL / then the name of the folder, which is my shop, then the name of the PHP file that allows us to delete the client, which is delete.php. So for the moment this row is created statically and we should fill it from the database. So here we have to start the PHP code. Then we need to connect to the database. So let's create the variables that will be used to connect to the database. So here we have the server name, which is localhost because the server is installed on my computer. Then we have the username, and the default username is root. Then we have the password, and as we can see the password is empty. Then we have the database, which is called my shop. Now let's establish the connection with the database. Then we can check if the connection is established correctly or not. So if we have any connection error, then we have to exit the execution of this file, and of course we will display the error message. Otherwise, we can read the data from the client's table. So here I create the SQL query. So in this query we will read all the data from this table. Then we will execute this query. So the result will be stored into this variable. Then we can check if the query has been executed correctly or not. So if we have any error during the execution of the query, then we will exit the execution of this file and we will display the error message. Otherwise, we can read the data from this object using a while loop. So in this while loop, we will read the rows from the database. And each row that we read from the database should be displayed into an HTML table. So inside the while loop, we have to use echo. And this statement allows us to print one row from the HTML table. So let's move this row into the echo statement. Then we need to replace the data of this row by the data of this array. So because we are inside double quotes, we don't need to use concatenation. We can directly use this array inside this row. So we can delete the old values, then we can use the array. Of course, we have to provide the array with the column name. So the first column is ID. Then the second column is the name. Then here we have the email address. Also, we need to provide the edit file and the delete file with the ID of the client. So here we have to add question mark, then the name of the parameter, let's say ID, then the value of the ID. So we can use this array. Then we have to do the same thing for the delete file. So let's copy all of this and let's paste it just here. So the ID allows the edit file to know which client we need to edit. And also it allows the delete file to know which client we need to delete. Now let's save this file. And let's run it. So we can go to the browser. Then let's write localhost. Then the name of the folder, which is my shop. Then the name of the PHP file, which is index.php. Let's press enter. And here we have 6 rows which are filled from the database. Now I will show you how to create a new client. So let's create a new PHP file. Let's call it create.php. Then here let's write exclamation mark. So let's change the title of this page. Let's call it my shop. Then let's add the bootstrap CSS link. So let's go back to index.php and let's copy this line. Let's paste it in the head. Now in the body, let's create the container class. And let's add some margin to this container. Then here let's write the title of this page. Then let's create the form that allows us to create a new client. So in this form, we don't need to provide the action because we need to submit the form to the same page, which is create.php. That's why we can delete the action. But we need to provide the method. So we need to submit the form using the HTTP post method. So we have here to write method equal post. Then let's create the first row into this form. So this is the first row of this form. It contains one label called name, and also it contains an input field called name. So this is the name of the parameter that will be submitted to the server. And here we can see that this input field is initially empty. Now let's copy this row and let's paste it. So the second row will be for the email. So let's change the name of the input field and let's call it email. Then let's add a new row for the phone number. Let's change the name of the input field and let's call it phone. Then let's add a new row for the address. We need also to change the name of this input field. Let's call it address. Now we need to add another row that contains the submit button. So here we have the submit button, but also we have the cancel button. And when we click on the cancel button, we should go to the list of clients. So here we need to change the URL. So when we click on the submit button, the data of the form will be submitted to this file. So at the beginning of this file, we need to read the submitted data. So here we need to write the PHP code that allows us to read the submitted data. So first let's create the variables that will store the data from the form. So these variables are initialized with empty values, and we will use them to fill the form if we have any error. So let's add these variables into our form. So here in the value, we need to display the name. Then let's copy this statement and let's add it to the other fields. So here we will display the email. Then here we will display the phone number. And here we have to display the address. Now let's check if the data has been transmitted using the post method. So if the data has been transmitted using the post method, then we can initialize these variables with the data from the form. Then we need to check that we don't have any empty field. We can use a while loop that is executed only one time. Using this loop, we can exit the loop using the break statement if we have any error. So we can use do while false. Then here we can check that we don't have any empty field. If any field is empty, we have to display this error message. And we need to exit the loop. Now let's initialize this variable with an empty value. We can initialize it just here. So if we don't have any empty field, then we can create a new client. So for the moment, I will just add a comment that says that here we need to insert a new client into the database. So after adding the new client into the database, we can initialize the different fields to empty values. We can also display a success message to the user. So the success message will be client added correctly. Now let's initialize this variable with an empty value. Now let's display the error message if it is not empty. We can display it just before the form. So we need to check if the error message is not empty. So if this variable is not empty, then we have to display the error message. Then let's display the success message if this variable is not empty. So we can display the success message just before the two buttons. So if this variable is not empty, then we have to display the success message. Now let's save this file and let's test it. So let's click on New Client. And we obtain this page. So let's fill the form. So for the moment, the address field is empty. Now let's click on Submit. So here we can see that we have this error message. And also we did not lose the data of the form. Now let's close this error message. But we can see that we cannot close it. This is because we need to add the Bootstrap JavaScript. So let's go back to the documentation website of Bootstrap. And let's copy this URL. Then in the head we need to add a new element. It is called script. Now let's save this file. Let's go back to the browser. Now let's fill the form. And let's submit the data. And we have this error message. So let's close it. And this time we can see that we can close it. Then let's provide the address. And let's submit the form again. So this time we have this success message. Now let's add the client into the database. So first we need to connect to the database. So here we will create the connection. Then we need to insert the new client. We can insert the client just here. So in this SQL query, we will insert a new client into the clients table. So we will insert the name, the email, the phone, and the address, using these variables that we have initialized from the data of the form. Then we will execute the SQL query. If we have any error, then we will display this error message. And we will exit the while loop. We can also redirect the user to the list of clients. So we have to add the following statements. So this statement allows us to redirect the user to the index file. And this statement allows us to exit the execution of this file. Now let's save this file and let's go to the browser. Then let's create a new client. Let's click on Submit and we have this error message. Then let's provide the address. Then let's click on Submit. But we have this error message. In fact, the email address should be unique, but this email address has been already used. That's why we have this error. So to fix this error, we need just to change this email address. So let's add number 2. And let's submit the form. So here we can see that this client has been added correctly, and we are redirected to the index page. Also, we can see that this email address is already used. Now I will show you how to edit a client. So let's create a new PHP file. Let's call it edit.php. So here we need to copy the HTML code from the create file. So let's copy all the HTML code. And let's paste it just here. Then in this form we need to add a hidden input that will store the ID of the client. So the type will be hidden. And the value is the ID of the client. So we can copy this statement and let's paste it here. Also we need to change the variable name, so it will be ID. Now let's create the different variables. Then let's check if we received the request using the get method or using the post method. So if the request is received using the get method, then we need to read the ID of the client. So first let's check if we have the ID of the client or not. So if the ID of the client does not exist, then we need to redirect the user and to exit the execution of this file. Otherwise, we can read the ID of the client from the request. Then we need to read the data of the client from the database. But first we need to connect to the database. So we can establish the connection with the database at the beginning of this file. So here we will connect to the database. And here we need to read the data of the client from the database. So this SQL query allows us to read the data of the client having this ID. And here we will execute the SQL query. Then we will read the data of the client from the database. If we don't have any data from the database, then we have to redirect the user to the index page and we have to exit the execution of this file. Otherwise, we can read the data from the database. So here we will store the data from the database into these 4 variables. And these variables are already displayed into the form. In the else, we received the request using the post method. So first let's read the data of the form. Then let's check that we don't have any empty field. So we can use a do-while loop. Then let's check that we don't have any empty field. So if any field is empty, then we have to display this error message. And we need to exit the while loop. Otherwise, we have to create the SQL query. So this SQL query allows us to update the data of the client. It allows us to update the name, the email, the phone, and the address. So here we will update the data of the client having this ID. Now let's execute this SQL query. Then let's check if the query has been executed correctly or not. So if we have an error, then we have to display the error message. And we need to exit the while loop. Otherwise, we can display the success message. We can also redirect the user to the index page and exit the execution of this file. Now let's save this file and let's go to the browser. So we can, for example, update the data of this client. So let's click on Edit. And here we have the data of the selected client. We can, for example, update the name. So let's add number 2. Then let's delete the address. Now let's click on Submit. But here we have this error. This means that the form does not contain the ID. So let's correct it. So in this hidden field, I did not add the name of the field. So here I have just to add the name. And the name should be ID. Now let's save this file. Let's go to the browser. And let's refresh this page. So we should not click on this button, because this button allows the data to be submitted again. We have just to put the cursor in this field and we have to press enter. Now let's update the name again. And let's delete the address. Let's click on submit. So here we have this error message. So we need to provide the address. Let's click on submit. So here we can see that the name and the address have been updated. And also we are redirected to the index page. Now I will show you how to delete a client. So we need to create a new PHP file. Let's call it delete.php. So in this file we don't need to write any HTML code. We need just to write PHP code. So the delete file will receive the request using the get method. So here we need to check if the get array contains the ID or not. So here we can use isSet to check if this array contains the ID or not. If it contains the ID, then we can read the ID. Then we need to connect to the database to delete the client. So here we will establish the connection with the database. Then we need to execute the SQL query that allows us to delete the client having this ID. So this statement allows us to execute the SQL query. Then we need to redirect the user to the index page. Now let's save this file and let's go to the browser. So here let's delete the last client. So let's click on delete. And here we can see that the client has been deleted and we are redirected to the index page.